Marcus Chen's black Mercedes hummed to a stop in the gravel parking lot of Betty's Diner, the luxury vehicle looking absurdly out of place among the pickup trucks and sedans that belonged to the working folks of Millbrook. He'd been stopping here every Tuesday and Thursday morning for the past 6 months, ever since his investment firm opened a satellite office 20 minutes down the highway. The diner wasn't convenient and the coffee wasn't exceptional, but Marcus had his reasons for coming back, reasons that had nothing to do with the food. He adjusted his Rolex, grabbed his leather briefcase, and stepped out into the crisp October morning. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and the familiar scent of bacon grease and burnt coffee wrapped around him like a well-worn blanket. The place hadn't changed since the 1970s, all cracked vinyl booths and formica countertops, with a jukebox in the corner that probably still played Johnny Cash if you fed it quarters. Marcus slid into his usual booth by the window, the one that gave him a clear view of the parking lot and the small-town Main Street beyond. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through stock reports, barely looking up when he heard the approaching footsteps he'd been anticipating. Sarah Martinez appeared beside his table with a pot of coffee and that same patient smile she wore every time he came in. She was 26, though she looked younger, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that suggested she'd seen more of life's hardships than someone her age should have. Her uniform was immaculate despite being clearly worn from years of use, the name tag pinned slightly crooked above her heart. She'd been working at Betty's since she was 19, putting herself through community college one class at a time, while supporting her younger brother after their parents died in a car accident. Marcus knew none of this because he'd never asked. To him, she was just the waitress, a background character in the daily theater of his important life. Sarah poured his coffee without waiting for confirmation, already knowing he took it black with 2 sugars, already knowing he'd order the scrambled eggs with wheat toast, already knowing he'd leave exactly a 15% tip calculated to the penny. She scribbled the order on her pad even though she didn't need to, a habit born from years of service industry professionalism, and headed toward the kitchen. She didn't notice Marcus watching her walk away, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He'd been planning this morning's entertainment for weeks now, ever since he'd overheard Sarah talking to another waitress about struggling to pay for her brother's textbook. The idea had formed slowly, crystallizing into what Marcus considered a harmless bit of fun, a way to break up the monotony of his Tuesday morning routine. When Sarah returned with his eggs, Marcus was ready. He'd rehearsed the lines in his head, imagined her reaction, anticipated the awkward laughter that would follow. What he hadn't anticipated was that this particular Tuesday would be the one that changed everything, that his casual cruelty would set in motion a series of events that would strip away the comfortable illusions he'd built around himself. Sarah set the plate down gently, refilled his coffee, and was turning to leave when Marcus cleared his throat loud enough that the couple in the next booth could hear. He paused for effect, watching her turn back with a slightly confused expression, and then delivered his punchline with practiced timing. "Hey Sarah, I've been thinking, times are tough, you know, economy's unpredictable, stock market's volatile. I might need to start a GoFundMe soon. Maybe you could chip in. I hear waitresses make great money in tips." The words hung in the air like smoke and Marcus grinned, waiting for the laugh, for the nervous smile, for her to play along with the joke that wasn't really a joke at all. Sarah stood perfectly still for 3 heartbeats, the coffee pot in her left hand, the weight of Marcus's words settling over the diner like morning fog. She could feel the eyes of other customers turning toward them, could sense the sudden tension in the air as people registered what had just been said. Old Tom at the counter had stopped mid-bite of his pancakes, the couple in the next booth had their conversation frozen on their lips, and even Betty herself had paused in the kitchen doorway, her weathered face a mask of barely contained anger. Marcus was still grinning, pleased with himself, waiting for the payoff of his joke, expecting embarrassment or a forced laugh, or certainly the kind of awkward subservience that service workers were trained to display no matter how badly customers behaved. What he got instead was something entirely different. Sarah set the coffee pot down on the table with deliberate care, pulled out her order pad, and clicked her pen, her face remaining neutral and professional, but with something in her eyes now, a spark of steel that Marcus was only beginning to recognize. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear, pitched just loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "You know what, Mr. Chen, That's actually a really interesting idea. Let me tell you about my GoFundMe instead. She flipped to a blank page in her notepad, not because she needed to reference anything, but because the gesture gave her words weight, made them official, and then she began to dismantle his entire worldview with calm precision. I work 55 hours a week at this diner. My take-home after taxes is about $22,000 a year. My brother Danny is 17, a senior at Millbrook High, and he's going to be the first person in our family to go to a 4-year college right out of high school, full scholarship to State University for Engineering, 4.0 GPA, president of the robotics club. Marcus's smile was starting to falter, but Sarah wasn't finished, the words coming easily now, flowing from some deep well of dignity she'd been storing up for years of small indignities and casual dismissals. Our parents died when he was 12, drunk driver, head-on collision on Route 47. I was 21, working part-time while finishing my associate's degree. I became his legal guardian because our only other relative was an aunt in Florida who didn't want the responsibility. I dropped out of school that semester and picked up full-time hours here and a weekend shift at the grocery store. The diner had gone completely silent, even the clatter from the kitchen had stopped, and Betty stood with her arms crossed and tears streaming down her face, because in 6 years of working together, she'd never heard Sarah tell this story, never heard the full weight of what the young woman carried every single day. I'm still paying off the funeral cost. I'm still paying the mortgage on our parents' house, because selling it would have meant moving Danny to a different school district right when he needed stability most. I'm still paying for the therapy he needed to process watching our parents' lives end. I'm 26 years old, Miss Chen, and I've got about $800 in my savings account. That's what I've managed to save in 5 years. Marcus had stopped smiling entirely now, staring at his eggs, at his phone, at anything but Sarah's face, his neck flushed red and acutely aware of every eye in the diner burning into him. He wanted to interrupt, to apologize, to make this stop, but something about Sarah's posture told him that interrupting would only make things worse. So yes, times are tough, the economy is unpredictable, but I'm guessing your definition of tough and mine are pretty different. I'm guessing when you worry about the stock market, you're worried about your portfolio shrinking, not about whether you'll have enough for groceries and the electric bill in the same week. I'm guessing your GoFundMe would be for a second vacation home, not for keeping the only home you've ever known. She clicked her pen, closed with a decisive snap, and tucked it back into her apron pocket, her voice carrying that faintest edge now, sharp as a razor. Your eggs are getting cold, Miss Chen. Is there anything else I can get you this morning? More coffee, hot sauce, a different perspective on what financial hardship actually looks like. Eleanor Rodriguez had been sitting in the corner booth of Betty's diner every Tuesday morning for the past 15 years, ever since her husband passed away and the silence of her empty house became too loud to bear, and at 73, she'd seen enough of life to recognize important moments when they happened. She'd noticed Marcus Chen months ago, had catalogued him in the way that elderly people do when they have time to observe the world around them, had seen his expensive clothes and his expensive car and his expensive watch, seen the way he barely looked at Sarah when she took his order, seen the 15% tips left with mathematical precision. She'd also seen Sarah, really seen her, in the way that Marcus never had watched the young woman work double shifts, had seen her studying nursing textbooks during slow periods, had noticed the way she always asked Danny about school when he stopped by after classes. Eleanor knew about the dead parents and the sacrificed education and the grinding poverty that Sarah wore like invisible chains, because she'd tried to help once, leaving a $100 tip with a note that said simply, "For Danny's books," but Sarah had chased her into the parking lot crying and tried to give it back, saying she couldn't accept charity, and Eleanor had refused to take it and driven away quickly before Sarah could press the money into her hands. That had been 6 months ago, and Sarah had never mentioned it again, but Eleanor had noticed the nursing textbook that appeared the following week, noticed the way Sarah's face had looked a little less tired for a while. Now Eleanor watched Marcus Chen's face turn red as Sarah delivered her quiet devastation, watched him shrink into his booth like a chastened child, and she felt no sympathy for him because men like Marcus Chen moved through the world, leaving small wounds wherever they went, never noticing the damage, because they never looked back long enough to see it. They made jokes about poverty while surrounded by wealth, made light of struggle while insulated from its realities, made themselves feel bigger by making others feel small, and Eleanor had known men like Marcus, had been married to one for 37 years, before cancer finally did what his conscience never could, and humbled him into something approaching humanity. Her husband had spent his final weeks apologizing for a lifetime of casual cruelties, of dismissive comments, of jokes made at the expense of people with less power, and Eleanor had forgiven him because that's what you do when someone's dying, but she'd never forgotten. She'd promised herself she'd never let that kind of behavior slide again, never sit silent while someone with everything mocked someone with nothing, and so as Sarah finished speaking, and clicked her pen with that decisive snap, Eleanor set down her coffee cup and did something she'd been taught never to do in polite society. She started clapping, the sound ringing out clear and sharp in the silent diner, one pair of old hands coming together in rhythmic applause, and every head turned toward her, including Sarah's and Marcus's. For a moment Eleanor thought she might be the only one, might stand alone in her approval, but then Tom at the counter joined in, his weathered farmer's hands creating a different rhythm, then the couple in the next booth, then Betty herself emerging from the kitchen with tears still streaming down her face, clapping so hard her palms turned red, and within seconds the entire diner was applauding, a dozen people standing in solidarity with a waitress who'd finally said what everyone had been thinking for months. Marcus Chen sat frozen in his booth, his eggs growing cold, his phone forgot, his entire worldview cracking like poorly laid foundation, and the applause washed over him, through him, and he understood with crystalline clarity that he was not the protagonist of this story, had never been the protagonist, had been cast as the villain without even realizing the role he was playing. Sarah stood beside his table looking stunned and overwhelmed, and on the verge of tears, because she hadn't expected this, hadn't wanted this attention, had simply reached a breaking point after months of small indignities, and decided that this morning, this Tuesday, she would not pretend that Marcus's joke was funny, or acceptable, or anything other than what it was. Eleanor caught Sarah's eye across the diner and nodded once, a gesture of solidarity from one generation of strong women to another, and Sarah nodded back, blinking rapidly, then turned and walked quickly toward the kitchen before the tears could fall. The applause faded gradually, people returning to their breakfasts with a new energy, animated conversations breaking out across the diner, and Eleanor heard fragments as people discussed what had just happened, heard the words about time and good for her, and did you see his face? She returned to her coffee, satisfied, because this was what community looked like when it functioned properly, when people stood together against casual cruelty, when someone finally drew a line and others recognized it as a line worth defending. 20 minutes after the applause died down, Marcus Chen was still sitting in his booth, his eggs having gone completely cold and congealed into an unappetizing mass that he couldn't bring himself to touch, his coffee having developed a thin film on top, his phone lying face down on the table and ignored for the first time in months. Most of the other customers had left, their breakfasts finished, their morning routines calling them back to jobs and errands and the 1,000 small obligations that made up a life, and Marcus should have left too because his office was waiting, meetings were scheduled, emails were piling up in his inbox with the relentless urgency that characterized his industry, but he couldn't make himself move. Something had broken inside him during Sarah's speech, some carefully constructed wall that had been keeping uncomfortable realities at bay, and he kept replaying the moment in his mind, the moment when his joke had landed not with laughter but with devastating precision, when Sarah had looked at him with those calm eyes and systematically dismantled everything he'd assumed about her, about himself, about the way the world worked. He'd thought he was making a harmless joke, thought they had rapport, thought she understood he was kidding, thought service workers were used to this kind of banter, thought a lot of things, and every single one of them had been wrong. Betty approached his table finally, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd spent 50 years reading people and situations, a woman who was 68, had owned the diner for 32 years, had raised 3 children, and buried one husband and seen enough of human nature to fill several libraries. She stood beside Marcus's booth, and looked down at him with an expression that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite pity, but contained elements of both. And when she asked if he was planning to sit here all morning, her voice was gruff but not unkind. Marcus looked up at her, and Betty was startled to see genuine confusion in his eyes, like a child who'd been punished for something he didn't understand, and he said quietly that he didn't know what to do, that he should apologize but didn't even know how, that saying sorry for making a joke about her being poor when she was actually struggling to survive didn't even begin to cover it. Betty slid into the booth across from him without asking permission, her old joints creaking slightly with the movement, and she folded her hands on the table and studied Marcus with the same intensity she brought to evaluating whether a pie crust needed another minute in the oven. "You know what your real mistake was?" Betty asked, her voice soft but relentless. "It wasn't the joke itself, though that was bad enough. Your real mistake was that you've been coming here twice a week for 6 months, and you never once saw Sarah as a person. You saw a waitress. You saw a role, not a human being." Marcus wanted to protest, to defend himself, but he couldn't because Betty was right, and he tried to remember a single personal conversation he'd had with Sarah, a single question he'd asked about her life beyond the immediate transactional needs of ordering breakfast, and he came up empty. Betty continued explaining that Sarah had been serving him for 6 months, taking his order, getting it right, keeping his coffee topped up, being pleasant even when he barely acknowledged her existence, and in all that time he'd never wondered about, never thought about what her life looked like outside these walls, never considered that maybe someone working 55 hours a week as a waitress might have a story worth knowing. Marcus felt something tight in his chest, something that might have been shame or grief, or the uncomfortable sensation of genuine self-awareness forcing its way through decades of practiced obliviousness. And when he said, "I'm not a bad person," he immediately realized how defensive it sounded, how insufficient. Betty's expression softened slightly as she told him no, he probably wasn't, but he'd been thoughtless, and sometimes thoughtlessness did just as much damage as malice, maybe more because at least malicious people knew what they were doing. She stood up, her knees protesting the movement, and told him that Sarah was in the back room, had been crying for the past 15 minutes, trying to pull herself together before her shift at the grocery store started, and if he wanted to apologize, now would be the time, but to make it genuine, to not apologize because he was embarrassed or because he wanted to feel better about himself, but to apologize because he understood what he did wrong and was committed to being different. Betty walked away, leaving Marcus alone with his cold eggs and his colder conscience, and he sat for another few minutes gathering courage, trying to find words that would mean something, that would convey genuine remorse rather than performative guilt, before finally standing up, straightening his expensive tie, and walking toward the kitchen on shaking legs. Sarah was sitting on a stack of milk crates in the back room when Marcus found her, her uniform still pristine but her face blotchy from crying, a wad of tissue clutched in one hand and her phone in the other, and Marcus could see a text conversation with someone named Dan and could see the words, "I think I just lost my job," on the screen, and the sight of it hit him like a physical blow because she wasn't crying about what she'd said to him, but because she thought there would be consequences, because in her experience standing up for yourself when you had no power meant losing what little you had. Marcus knocked softly on the doorframe and Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes widening when she saw him, and she stood quickly, wiping at her face with the tissues, trying to compose herself into the professional mask she wore for customers. "Miss Chan, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said all that. I was out of line. If you want to speak to Betty about—" But Marcus interrupted more forcefully than he'd intended, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Stop, please, just stop. You weren't out of line. You were completely, absolutely in the right, and I was completely, absolutely in the wrong. I came back here to apologize, not to get you in trouble." Sarah stared at him with disbelief written plainly on her face, because in her 6 years of service work she'd had customers complain about her to management dozens of times, usually for things that weren't her fault, and she'd had customers apologize to her exactly never. Marcus took a deep breath and tried to find the words that Betty had challenged him to find, words that were genuine rather than performative, explaining that he'd made a thoughtless, cruel joke at her expense, that he'd made assumptions about her life without knowing anything about it, that he'd treated her like she wasn't a real person with real struggles and real dignity, and he'd done it because he'd spent his entire life in a bubble where he never had to think about what things actually cost, never had to worry about money, never had to consider that his definition of financial problems might be someone else's definition of wild luxury. Sarah was still watching him warily, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the apology to come with conditions or expectations. But Marcus pressed on, his voice unsteady. He told her that Betty was right, that Sarah had been serving him twice a week for 6 months, doing her job perfectly, being professional and pleasant, and he'd never once asked her a single personal question, never saw her, only saw a waitress, someone there to serve him, and he'd never looked deeper than that. He ran his hand through his hair in genuine frustration with himself, and explained that he made jokes like the one he'd made this morning because in his world they were harmless. In his world, financial problems meant his portfolio was down for the quarter or his accountant was annoying him about tax strategies, but he'd never had to worry about keeping a roof over his head, or feeding someone he was responsible for, or choosing between two necessary expenses because he couldn't afford both. Never had to sacrifice his education for someone else, never had to work 55 hours a week just to stay barely above water. Sarah's expression was softening slightly though, she still looked guarded, and she said quietly that he couldn't have known all that she didn't talk about it, didn't want pity, but Marcus shook his head firmly. That's exactly my point. I couldn't have known because I never asked. I never wondered. I never treated you like someone who might have a story worth knowing. And that's on me. That's a failure of basic human decency on my part. He paused, trying to find the right words for what he needed to say next, explaining that he couldn't fix what he said, couldn't take back the joke or erase the fact that he made it, but he could tell her that he heard everything she said out there, and he understood, and it was going to change how he moved through the world, that he was going to be better, going to see people instead of roles, and he was going to start by actually seeing her. Sarah was crying again, but differently this time, tears of relief and exhaustion rather than fear and shame, and she whispered that she thought she was fired, thought he was going to complain and Betty would have to let her go and she'd lose everything. Marcus felt that tight feeling in his chest again, that uncomfortable awareness of just how much power he held in this interaction, how precarious Sarah's position really was, and he said firmly, "You're not fired. If anything, Betty looks like she wants to give you a raise and make you employee of the century. Everyone in that diner was on your side, Sarah. Everyone, because what you said needed to be said and you said it with more dignity and grace than I deserve." Sarah smiled slightly, a watery expression that transformed her tired face into something luminous, and she said, "Thank you for apologizing. You didn't have to." But Marcus replied quietly, "Yes, I really." Marcus sat in his Mercedes in the parking lot of Betty's diner for another 20 minutes after leaving the back room, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his mind racing through implications and possibilities while his phone buzzed with increasing urgency, messages from his assistant asking where he was, emails from clients who expected immediate responses, calendar notifications reminding him of meetings he was missing, and he ignored all of it. Something had shifted in him during those conversations, first with Betty and then with Sarah, something fundamental about how he understood the world and his place in it, because he'd spent his entire adult life optimizing for efficiency and profit, viewing every interaction through the lens of what he could gain from it, measuring his success by the size of his portfolio and the prestige of his client list. He'd been good at it, had built a small fortune by the age of 38, had achieved everything he'd set out to achieve, and sitting here in his expensive car in the parking lot of a humble diner, he realized that none of it had made him a good person because success and goodness were not the same thing, and he'd conflated them for so long that he'd forgotten there was a difference. Marcus pulled out his phone and opened his banking app, navigating to his personal account, and the number that appeared on the screen was substantial, more money than most people would see in a lifetime, more than he could spend in several years even if he tried, and he thought about Sarah's $800 in savings, about 5 years of grinding work distilled into a number that wouldn't even cover his car payment. He thought about her brother Danny, about full scholarships and robotics clubs, and the future that Sarah was sacrificing herself to secure. Thought about the casual joke he'd made about needing a GoFundMe, about how completely disconnected his reality was from hers, thought about Eleanor Rodriguez applauding in the corner booth, about an entire diner full of people standing up for Sarah, about community and solidarity and the kind of human decency that transcended economic status. Then Marcus started making phone calls, the first to his assistant telling her to cancel his morning meetings and reschedule them for tomorrow, the second to his accountant asking about the tax implications of charitable giving and how to structure a gift to maximize its benefit to the recipient, the third to his lawyer, discussing the best way to set up an education fund that couldn't be refused or returned, that would be administered by a third party, so there would be no uncomfortable sense of personal debt. His accountant Jennifer, a practical woman who'd been managing his finances for a decade, listened to his plan, and then said something that stopped him cold. "Marcus, this is generous, but are you sure you're doing this for the right reason? I've seen people make grand gestures out of guilt before, and it usually doesn't end well. Charity shouldn't be about making yourself feel better." Marcus sat with that for a long moment, really examining his motivations, asking himself if he was trying to assuage his guilt, if this was just another form of ego, of wanting to be seen as the magnanimous rich guy who swoops in to save the day, or if this was something different, something more genuine. "Jennifer," he said finally, "I made a woman cry today because I was thoughtless and cruel. I made a joke about poverty to someone who is actually poor, someone who has sacrificed everything for her family. I can't undo that, but I can make her life materially easier, and I can do it in a way that respects her dignity and doesn't create a power dynamic where she feels indebted to me. That's what I want to do, not because it makes me a good person, but because it's the right thing to do regardless of what it makes me." There was silence on the other end of the line, and then Jennifer's voice came back softer, saying, "Okay, let's figure out how to do this right." And they spent the next 15 minutes working through the details. They structured an anonymous education fund for Danny as a scholarship from a fictitious foundation, administered through the community college, with no connection to Mark, enough to cover 4 years of university, room and board, books, everything, enough to take that burden off Sarah's shoulders completely, and separately a grant to the diner itself, money for employee benefits and wage increases, structured as a community investment fund that would benefit everyone who worked there, with no names attached, no recognition, just money where it was needed, flowing from someone who had too much to people who had too little. 3 weeks later, Sarah was called into the office of the community college financial aid administrator, a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson who Sarah had worked with during her own brief time as a student, and she'd taken the call during her lunch break at the grocery store, had barely been able to hear over the noise of the loading dock, but she'd caught the words "scholarship" and "your brother" and "please come in as soon as possible." She'd managed to get coverage for the rest of her shift, had driven to the college with her heart hammering, trying not to hope too much, trying not to imagine what this might mean, and when she sat in the worn chair across from Mrs. Patterson's desk in that small cluttered office, filled with filing cabinets and inspirational posters, and the accumulated paperwork of thousands of students trying to claw their way toward better futures, she folded her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. "Sarah," Mrs. Patterson began, her eyes bright behind her glasses, "I've been working in financial aid for 27 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. A foundation called the Merit Scholars Initiative has selected Danny for a full scholarship, Sarah, tuition, room and board, books, stipend for expenses, 4 years, completely covered. He doesn't have to work, he doesn't have to take out loans, he just has to maintain a 3.0 GPA and stay enrolled full-time." Sarah stared at her, the words not quite processing, because full scholarship, 4 years, no loans, it was impossible. Things like this didn't happen to people like her, to families like hers. There was always a catch, always fine print, always some requirement that would disqualify them at the last moment. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered. "Danny already has a scholarship. He has the State University scholarship for tuition. How can he get another one? And I've never heard of the Merit Scholars Initiative. When did he even apply for this?" Mrs. Patterson smiled gently and explained that he didn't apply, that this was a different kind of scholarship, one that was awarded based on recommendations from community members who identified deserving students, that someone nominated Dan, someone who knew about his circumstances and his achievements, and wanted to make sure he had every opportunity to succeed without financial burden. Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes, and said she needed to thank whoever nominated him, needed to tell them what this meant, but Miss Patterson shook her head, explaining that the foundation required anonymity, that the donor wanted no recognition, no contact, no acknowledgement, that they just wanted Danny to have the opportunities he deserved. And then Sarah understood, not the specific detail, not the name or the exact mechanism, but the shape of it, and she thought about that Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago, about standing in the diner, and finally saying everything she'd been holding back for months, thought about Marcus Chen's face, about his genuine apology, about the way he'd looked at her in that back room, like he was seeing her for the first time. She thought about the power of words, about how sometimes speaking truth to power actually changed things, actually mattered, actually created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate moment, and she started crying in earnest then, her hands over her face, her shoulders shaking with the force of years of tension, finally releasing. Mrs. Patterson came around the desk and put her arms around Sarah, this woman she barely knew, and held her while she cried, while she processed what this meant, while she absorbed the reality that her brother would go to college without debt, without the grinding anxiety of loans and part-time jobs, and choosing between textbooks and groceries, that he would have the chance she'd never had, the chance their parents had wanted for both of them. When Sarah finally composed herself enough to speak, she asked if she could call Danny, and Miss Patterson nodded and stepped out of the office to give her privacy, and Sarah pulled out her phone with shaking hands and dialed her brother's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice bright and young, and completely unaware that his entire future had just changed, and Sarah had to take 3 deep breaths before she could speak, before she could tell him the news that would lift the weight of worry from both their shoulders, before she could say the words that would make everything they'd sacrificed and struggled for, finally worth. "Danny," she said, her voice breaking, "I need you to sit down. I have something to tell you, and it's going to change everything." 6 months after that Tuesday morning that changed everything, Marcus Chen walked into Betty's diner for the first time since his public humiliation, his heart pounding, his palms sweating, uncertain of the reception he'd receive, but knowing he needed to come back, needed to face the place where he'd been broken down and rebuilt into something better. The bell above the door chimed, just like it always had, and the smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee wrapped around him like that well-worn blanket. But this time he wasn't here for the routine or the convenience, or any of the selfish reasons that had brought him before. He was here because Betty's diner had become, in his mind, a sacred place, the location of his transformation, and he needed to see it again, needed to see Sarah again, needed to know if the changes he'd made in his life were real or just elaborate performances of guilt. The diner was crowded with the morning rush, and Marcus noticed Eleanor Rodriguez in her corner booth, noticed Tom at the counter, noticed the same cast of characters who'd witnessed his shame and Sarah's strength, and when they saw him there was a moment of recognition, of tension. But then Eleanor smiled slightly and nodded, and Marcus felt something in his chest unclench just a fraction. Sarah emerged from the kitchen with a pot of coffee, and when she saw Marcus standing by the door, her steps faltered for just a moment before she recovered, and Marcus couldn't read her expression, couldn't tell if she was angry or uncomfortable or simply indifferent, but she walked toward him with that same professional composure she'd always carried. "Mr. Chen," she said quietly, and Marcus shook his head. "Marcus, please, just Mark. I was wondering if you have a minute to talk, but if you're busy or if you'd rather I leave, I completely understand." Sarah studied him for a long moment, and Marcus could see her making calculations, weighing risks, deciding if this was worth her time and emotional energy, and he wouldn't have blamed her if she'd said no, if she'd asked him to leave and never come back. But instead she glanced at Betty, who nodded from behind the counter, and gestured toward an empty booth by the window, the same booth where everything had started 6 months ago. They sat across from each other, and Marcus noticed immediately how different this felt from all those previous Tuesdays, noticed that he was actually seeing Sarah now, actually registering her as a complete human being, rather than a background character in his story. "I wanted to tell you that Danny's doing amazing at State," Sarah said, and there was something in her voice, some mixture of gratitude and suspicion, and careful hope. "He's pulling a 3.8 his first semester, he's joined 2 engineering clubs, and he's the happiest I've ever seen him. That scholarship, the Merit Scholars Initiative, It changed everything for us. Marcus nodded, keeping his face neutral, because he'd made Jennifer and his lawyer promise that the anonymity would be absolute, that there would be no paper trail connecting him to the foundation, no way for Sarah to ever confirm what she clearly suspected. I'm glad he's doing well. You must be proud. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. I am. I'm also grateful to whoever set up that scholarship, whoever saw Danny's potential and decided to invest in it, whoever that was. They gave us our lives. The words hung between them, loaded with unspoken understanding, and Marcus held her gaze steadily. Sounds like Danny earned it. Sounds like whoever nominated him recognized something worth support. They sat in silence for a moment, and then Sarah said, Betty told me you've been volunteering at the community center, that you've been mentoring first-generation college students, helping them with financial literacy and career planning. Eleanor mentioned you've been eating at local restaurants and leaving huge tips, actually talking to the servers, learning their names and their stories. Tom said you funded the new equipment for the high school robotics program. Marcus felt his face flush because he hadn't realized how small Millbrook actually was, how quickly word spread in communities where people actually paid attention to each other. I'm trying to be better. That morning 6 months ago, you held up a mirror, and I didn't like what I saw. So I'm working on becoming someone different, someone who actually sees people and contributes something meaningful beyond just making money. Sarah's expression softened, and she reached across the table and briefly touched his hand, a gesture of forgiveness and recognition. You're doing good work, Marcus, real work, the kind that actually matters. Marcus felt tears prick his eyes, unexpected and embarrassing, because he'd spent 6 months trying to prove to himself that he could change, that the shame and humiliation of that Tuesday morning could be transformed into something constructive, and Sarah's simple acknowledgement meant more than any professional achievement he'd ever earned. I'm sorry, he said, his voice. I'm sorry for what I said, for how I treated you, for all the ways I moved through the world without seeing the damage I was causing. I'm sorry it took your courage to make me wake up. Sarah nodded, accepting the apology, and then she smiled, a real smile that transformed her face. You know what? I'm not sorry. That morning was terrifying and humiliating and one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it needed to happen. You needed to hear it. I needed to say it. And apparently the universe decided that little diner in Millbrook was going to be the place where both of us learned something important about dignity and respect and what really matters. Marcus laughed, a wet sound that was half, and Sarah laughed too, and around them the diner continued its morning rhythm, coffee being poured and eggs being flipped and people coming together for breakfast and conversation. And Eleanor Rodriguez watched from her corner booth with tears in her eyes because this was what redemption looked like when it was real, when it was earned through actual change, rather than hollow apology. Marcus stayed for an hour drinking coffee and talking to Sarah about Danny's classes and the community center programs, and the small ways he was trying to use his resources to actually help, rather than just accumulate. And when he finally left, he placed $200 on the table, not as a tip, but as a donation to the employee fund that he'd anonymously established 6 months ago, the fund that had given Sarah her first raise in 3 years and health insurance for the first time in her adult life. As he walked to his car, Marcus looked back at Betty's diner, at the humble building that had become the site of his transformation, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years, maybe hadn't felt ever. He felt like a good person, or at least like someone who was genuinely trying to become one, someone who'd learned that wealth and success meant nothing without compassion and awareness, and the willingness to see every person you encountered as fully human and worthy of respect. The bell above the door chimed as another customer entered, and Marcus smiled, got in his car and drove away, knowing he'd be back next Tuesday, not as a thoughtless regular seeking routine, but as someone committed to being part of a community, to supporting the people in it and never again making the mistake of seeing roles instead of human beings.